All right, awesome. So thanks, everybody. I asked for a bigger room, but this is what we got. So standing room only. So we're here to talk about the Eureka platform. This is the overview talk. We have a couple other ones tomorrow to get into some of the details. So this is the introduction for anybody who doesn't understand, the details on Eureka and what it really is, but we'll get into some slight level as well of explanations. Okay, so let's proceed. So this is the abstract of the talk. So we've already seen that. I don't think it's going to be a problem for anybody. So this is what we're going to talk about today. I'll give you a bit of background on Eureka, sort of generally what it is, how we got here, and then describe some of its key functionalities. In particular, it's an API gateway. It does a whole bunch of things with regards to authentication, authorization, including sidecars. It introduces application support to Folio. So this is application formalization, the first steps of it. And it also provides a number of manager services that help manage the platform and in particular things related to the above. Okay, so the background is that Eureka is essentially introduced because we need to move Folio to the next level. We need to scale it up for higher levels of operations, more complex things. We've got a lot of requests coming in for how do we connect to this type of protocol? How do we authenticate with SSOs? How do we do multiple IDPs, et cetera? So what we do is we introduce some highly regarded open source single responsibility components to do these things that we've managed to do so far with built-in componentry in Folio. So we want to do routing, so that's directing calls to the proper modules and so forth. So we have Kong to do this. Kong is an API gateway, open source. We want to do next level of authorization, authentication. So for that, we introduce Keycloak. And finally, we're going to introduce sidecars as a way to sort of distribute the load on these authorization responsibilities. And we build that around Quarkus, yet another third-party component. So, and as I was saying before, Eureka, embraces the formalization of applications, and it has a number of things that it introduces for that purpose. Okay, so when we set off to do the Eureka design, we had a couple of priorities that we had to ensure to do. First one is backward compatibility. So we're focusing on the core of the platform. We're not trying to redo all of Folio, where all the value of the project really is in the applications that are specialized for library needs. So Eureka has to be and had to be compatible with the existing modules. So you could take the modules and drop them into Eureka platform and they would work just fine. The second thing is we really wanted to focus on security. Security these days with all these data breaches and all these different requirements is becoming a priority. So we're introducing Eureka for this. It's well-established. We're going to Keycloak for this within Eureka to support these responsibilities. And we delegate everything in that aspect to Keycloak. And it's a well-supported community. It's adopted a number of different places. And very importantly, it keeps up. So it releases a lot of upgrades to keep up with the latest threats and renovations and fixes and so forth. So that's extremely important. As for application support, so Eureka is introducing the concept of application descriptors, similar to our module descriptors that we have now, but at the application level. And also some services to help you manage those applications and entitlement to those applications. So just in summary, the features for the Eureka is that, we have these components. We have Kong for an API gateway. We have Keycloak, single responsibility component. As part of the package, we're also introducing roles. Role management is a way to basically distribute those entitlements at the user level for authorization to do different activities. And sidecars is one of the technical details for how we implement it. But again, compatibility with the existing modules is important. So here's sort of a high-level picture to help you sort of picture what, understand where these things go. So we have in Folio a number of modules, which are down here. Modules are attached to sidecars. We have a gateway, Kong, that routes traffic to the sidecars. And you'll see there's some interesting arrows here between sidecars, we'll get to in a second. Stripes is always Stripes. It's on top, and the user interacts with Stripes, the UI. But all these different components fall back to Keycloak for doing authorization. So authorization, authentication happens in Keycloak. And we have manager services, which are used as part of the flow to deliver and control access to the different pieces of Folio. So let's talk a little bit about the gateway. So for the gateway, we have adopted Kong, specifically Kong Gateway. It's the open source version. It's not Kong Gateway Plus or the enterprise one, which are not free, but this is the free open source one. So it's lightweight, it's flexible, it's your typical reverse proxy type of gateway. Interestingly, it's extensible, so you can actually write plugins for Kong to extend the functionality if we need to do that. It supports a number of different hosting organization architectures, and it has a couple of components that come with it. So it has a UI for administrating Kong and setting up your routes and so forth. And it has, most importantly to us, it has an admin API, which is how we interact from Eureka with Kong to set up the configurations. So let's talk about authentication for a little bit. So authentication is Keycloak's responsibility, right? So one of its responsibilities. We put authentication in Keycloak. So Keycloak, as such, is responsible for delivering login forms, managing the user data that's used for authentication. In other words, your user ID, your password, and so forth. It has already, right out of the box, support for things we've long wanted in Folio. So it can support multiple IDP configurations at once. So you can configure one Folio deployment to speak to multiple IDPs for authenticating users into it. And it supports different, multiple SSO protocols. Right now, you've just got SAML2 in the existing legacy classic platform, but we now have access to more. Keycloak is, of course, Apache v2 open source. It has to be if we're going to use it in the project. And it does provide, all the features that we want. And it is also extensible, by the way. So the authentication involves, first of all, user management. So as part of Eureka, what we've done is we've sort of isolated from the existing structures of Folio with the user application, the parts of the user data which are related to authentication versus what is personal information. So if you've got a password, a username, that's for authentication. If you have an email, first name and last name, the name of your mother-in-law's first dog, that's all personal information. So we separate it out and we put the auth data, the auth user data essentially into Keycloak, and that's where it's responsible. And we leave on the Folio side all the personal information. So this, again, is backward compatible. So mod users is what it is. It remains unchanged. It works with this mechanism. And of course, you still manage users in the usual user app. So get some details into this a little bit. The way we do this is we have a new module called Mod Users Keycloak. And its responsibility is to basically act as a facade to the existing user workflows. So when you have the UI that calls, it'll either into Folio for the backend, it'll either call the mod users BL, which is the business logic, which has some convenience functions, or directly to mod users. So mod users Keycloak provides compatible API interfaces and intercepts that call, and it redirects the appropriate information to either of those modules or to Keycloak if it's auth data. So it recognizes this is auth data, it's going to Keycloak, or this is regular personal data, it's going to the usual place, which is mod users. And so important to note here is that this implementation, this mod user Keycloak, also provides functionality to migrate your users from the existing storage. So if you have an existing user, they'll be stored in the storage for mod users currently. So as you migrate into the Eureka platform, you need to migrate those users. So it will take care of that for you. It'll create the auth user records on the fly as you go in. One important thing to realize is that passwords are not going to be migrated automatically, and that's what you would sort of expect. You wouldn't imagine that you can take your password from one place and drop it in another. So you will need to recreate the passwords of the users. And furthermore, patron records. So remember, users in Folio may contain both patrons and staff users. Patron records are not migrated to Keycloak. And that makes sense because patrons don't ever authenticate into Folio, so there's no reason to put their auth data into Keycloak. All right, so in addition to the things that we're adding, there's a couple things which no longer are needed in a platform that's under Eureka. In particular, we no longer need mod login or mod login SAML because this functionality is provided by Keycloak. and including especially the login screen. So it's important in any security system now that the login screen, if you've ever experienced sort of the SSO logins, I'm sure you have, is generated from your IDP. It's not generated from your application. So this is coming from Keycloak, and we can customize it, which we've done. It's got theming support so that we make it look just like the existing login screen from Folio in the classic platform. And then we've also introduced another one, which is another module, ModLogin Keycloak, whose purpose is essentially to replace the interfaces that are normally being provided by ModLogin. So if we take away ModLogin, because we don't need to generate some of the stuff from before, we still need to support the interfaces. So ModLogin Keycloak does that. It's the equivalent to ModLogin, and it does, all this stuff you would expect it to do, including out-of-the-box support for refresh token rotation. That's that, which is our primary authentication mechanism going forward. Refresh token rotations is a mechanism we've introduced into Folio, which we're rolling out. We're deprecating the old authentication. The idea is that you no longer have a token that lasts forever that can be replayed. It's just simply a mechanism to require an active refresh to get a second token for that purpose. Okay. All right. So that was authentication. This is really, authentication is about identifying the users. Who are you? And so forth. And that's what we were discovering. Authorization is the second piece of that, which is also a Keycloak responsibility. Authorization is about, what can you do? So let me sort of walk you through how that works in Eureka and Keycloak separately from the traditional Folio platform. So in Folio Classic, as you're all familiar with, I'm sure, we have a permission model. Permissions are defined as part of the API definition. They're contained in the module descriptor, and they're very much endpoint specific. So you define a permission based on an endpoint that lets you retrieve, let's say, an item record from inventory, and it's sort of bundled together. The permission will be structured in such a way to say, this is the item record, and this is the action, which is get the item. It's one permission to do the whole thing. And there's a naming convention for that. In other words, we want to identify the item and then the action, but it hasn't always been consistently applied in Folio. So it's one thing. And it's one sort of permission that does two pieces of information, and it's something that a user possesses. A user is assigned directly a permission. So, yeah, and some other comments here, basically that, permissions also beget permission sets, and they can be infinitely composed into very long lists of cascading permissions. So let's talk about Eureka though. So the way Eureka works is structured around the Keycloak data model, and the data model is slightly different. So first of all, there's not a permission that is going to be sort of defining at the same time the action and the resource. Instead, they have what they call a Keycloak permission, which basically has a resource that it points to. So that's in this example, a loan, and a scope, which is the action that says, this Keycloak permission is going to allow me to create a loan record in the database. But obviously, the first problem is, well, this is confusing because we've already got something called permissions and it works differently. So we're calling them capabilities. This is just a term we've introduced to distinguish them. It's essentially a Keycloak permission. But then you say, well, then, okay, great, there's a permission. How do I get to this permission? How do I use it, this capability? This is what policies are for. So in the Keycloak model and therefore the Eureka model, we have introduction of a policy. And a policy is something that is granting you access to a capability. So we say, okay, that's great. Now you've got some policies. So what? I want to make it possible for a user to do something in particular. Well, this is where roles come in. So we have roles. The Keycloak model and the Eureka model supports the concept of a role. And a role is essentially a way to gather together and join a user and a particular activity that they want to do, and capability that they want to achieve in the Folio system. So what this means is you basically, you give a user a role, and you've predefined the role to include a specific kind of policy, a role policy, and that role policy is included in a capability. So essentially, you can manage and assign users capabilities by assigning them to a role. So this is sort of a role-based access model that we're implementing here. The next question, and I see Jeremy almost got his hand up, is to say, but what this is going to create a lot of roles. Every time you want to assign one user a particular combination, and you have to create a role just for that? Well, no, you don't, because we also support user-based access controls as well. So it is possible to directly assign a user a policy, specifically a user policy, to get more of a direct access to a particular capability. So that's accounted for. So we have, we don't have a management nightmare as a result of that. And just a final word, so there are these other policies at the top. So in addition to, role policies and user policies that I've just mentioned, you can have other policies that are available, and that includes location-based or time-based policy. And what is that? That means in Folio Classic, you give somebody a permission, and they can do that anytime. They have access to create loans, for example. But maybe what you have is the classic example. You have a student member who works in the checkout desk Monday to Friday. Well, you don't want them to go to their dorm room on Saturday and start checking out things to people. So you can put a time-based restriction on that and say, well, this is only going to be this. We can apply policy. A time-based policy is this is only going to be possible from Monday to Friday from 9 to 5. So these are the policies in Folio. So everything, just to point out, everything that I've described here is contained within Keycloak. So this is the Keycloak model that we've implemented to provision the ability to grant authorization to users. Now, that's not Folio, that's Keycloak, right? So how does this going to work on Folio? How do I manage these things? So we have a correspondence in data models between what happens in Keycloak and what happens in Folio. We have a user application in Folio, and you continue to use that. And as I was shown before, it'll communicate through the new mod users Keycloak and do the appropriate things on the back end into Keycloak. So we have introduced roles within Folio as well. So those talk to the roles in Keycloak. We've got a preliminary implementation. We'll have some more for managing policies within Folios, and those will map into the policies on the Keycloak side. Now, what you'll notice, though, is that there's Folio admin, Folio system. Folio admin represents what an administrative user in Folio can do. Folio system is something that is done as part of your deployment and provisioning of a Folio hosting, and you'll see capabilities and capability sets, which is just a gathering of multiple capabilities. This happens on the Folio system. And why is that? That is because, well, essentially, capabilities are defined by the modules you install, the applications that you install. So there's really no need for anybody to start defining new ones or anything. They simply represent what the system can do. And this is done at deployment. So it's actually one less thing that the administrator needs to worry about. And obviously the capabilities, they map to the Keycloak permission, because that's what capabilities really are. And they grant you the resource and the scope. All right, so talk about sidecars for a little bit. So sidecars are a new concept that we're introducing here. So sidecars, they're an architectural pattern where, if you imagine, we have modules in Folio that conduct certain operations. You've got APIs that let you put this and get that. But the modules themselves are not really concerned about Folio, about security. They don't implement security. Security in the classic Folio is performed by Okapi and some of our other components like mod permissions and mod auth token. So sidecars are essentially a piece that you attach to the module to allow it to have some authorization. So how does that work? So sidecar is essentially a module-to-module proxy and authorization filter, and I'll explain that in a minute. But as mentioned before, it's built around Quarkus. So Quarkus is an open source framework that we use to build this, and it has Kafka implemented as part of its coordination. We deliver, again, a single component. So Folio module. Sidecar is a single module in Folio, and it provides modules to all of the different, provides sidecars to all the different modules, because we don't want to have to spin up an entire new module every time you put a sidecar in. So there is one place that delivers sidecars to the different modules. The sidecar interacts with the application manager. So the application manager is one of those manager services that I mentioned earlier. We'll get to that in a couple screens down, but it basically pulls the information that it needs from the application manager so it knows what capabilities are available and how to dole them out to the proper calls. It receives messages from the entitlement manager. So that's another one of those manager services. The reason it does this is, you've got a system up and running and you now add a new tenant to the system, or you add some new application, the sidecar needs to know about this. So it uses Kafka for doing messaging to update its own knowledge of what is the current configuration. An important point, though, is that the sidecar is responsible for all ingress and egress to module requests. In other words, everything goes through the sidecar when you make a call to a module. So let's picture that a little bit, compare it to how things work in the classic Okapi-based Folio. In the Okapi-based Folio, a request comes in from a user. It goes to Okapi. Okapi has its role in authorization by checking, what is the permission needed to call this particular endpoint. It then interacts with mod permissions to see what permissions the user making the call has and whether those intersect the permissions needed. It'll check the token that the user has been obtained, and then it'll make the call to the module and respond back with proxying the request. So everything gets sort of centralized at this point. In the new Eureka model, we sort of split apart the responsibilities, right? We have single responsibility components. So we have Kong as a gateway, we have Keycloak for authorization, and we have the sidecar, which is essentially the barrier, the authorization barrier. So then the call comes into Kong, and the sidecar, it just gets routed because, well, Kong is just an API gateway, gets routed to the sidecar, and the sidecar talks with Keycloak, may have cached that information as part of its deployment or a message it's received, and it makes the calls, it proxies it to the module. So we've sort of moved the authorization barrier, which is the sidecar, closer to the module, as opposed to centralizing everything in one place. And so you may be thinking, well, that's interesting. What can we do with that? Well, one possibility we can do with this, for sure, if we've done, is we can optimize sort of the traffic flow through the deployment, because in the past, when you would make the call through a copy, everything goes through a copy. It's for authorization. So it calls module 1, module 2. But now, because the authorization barrier has been lowered closer to the module, we can actually do direct module to module calls. You don't have to go back up through the gateway to get into module number 2. So this is an efficiency that we think should be helpful for routing traffic through the Eureka platform. Okay, so I'm probably talking a little fast here, so I want to make sure we have time for questions, but please forgive me. Authorization flows. So what are authorization flows? So one of the key benefits we have with Eureka is that it is fully responsible for, it's using Keycloak for all responsibilities for security authorization. So as I mentioned before, Keycloak has frequent updates. It is well maintained, and it keeps up with the latest vulnerabilities that have been identified, and we can update that quickly. And it also provides support for different mechanisms that we don't currently have support for, whether it be protocols or different flows with how you do authentication with a third-party SSO. So this diagram shows you sort of how Okapi does the authorization flow. So I was speaking quickly so that I could spend the next 20 minutes walking through this with you guys. But I won't do that. So this is basically detail, and you can look at the slides later. It's actually on the wiki as well. But let me point out the highlight of what we're seeing here. What we're really seeing is this is the pattern that we have in the traditional Folio classic deployment, where you essentially have a hub and spoke model. UI modules here wants to talk to the backend module here. So there's a call to Okapi, and Okapi is central with everything. It checks the token, it checks permissions, and it does a bunch of stuff, but it's a lot of back and forth traffic and everything is centralized. It's a hub and spoke. And so we can compare that to how things work in Eureka. And again, simplifying that, it's much more linear. So we have a UI module wants to talk to the backend module down here. You call the gateway checks its routing tables, calls the appropriate sidecar. The sidecar talks to Keycloak, does whatever it needs to do, and makes the call and proxies it back. So it's a much more linear workflow for authorization this way. Okay, and if you want to know more about the details of what we just talked about for authorization authentication, we've got another talk tomorrow, here's the time, where we will go into some more technical details for how this works. Okay, so application support. I think application support is, as I mentioned, we have with Eureka introduced mechanisms to manage the concept of an application as opposed to just the module. So it's the next level up. So modules are what we're familiar with right now in Folio. You deploy a bunch of modules, and for a large extent, Folio is nothing but a big bag of modules. So it'd be great to organize them in a better hierarchy so we can say, well, I want to deploy inventory application here. So how do I do that? Well, you got to remember, well, see, there's mod inventory, there's UI inventory, there's mod inventory storage, and that's an easy one. But then you can get into applications and that get for acquisitions, and then that gets really crazy. So the application formalization is there to let you say, I want to deploy, the orders application and acquisition. And so it knows exactly what modules need to go with that. It's a packaging mechanism to some extent. So how does that work? So our application support in Eureka says applications contain modules, and modules belong to one application. Modules are still, as always, defined by their module descriptor. So because it's 100% backward compatible, right? And then application descriptors are a new concept we introduced, which essentially reference the module descriptors. So what does that mean? That means if I have the inventory example, I've got those 3 modules. Well, 3 module descriptors, those are referenced by the application descriptor, and we have consistency at that level. And the manager services, the new manager services for Eureka, will consume those module descriptors that are linked from the application descriptor and calculate the new capabilities that have to be granted. Because remember, the module descriptors contain the permissions. The permissions get interpreted and turned into capabilities, which get fed into Keycloak. So the manager services do this. So it's much easier to handle the transition that way. An important point, Eureka does not attempt right now to establish the ideal set of applications. So when I say there's application support, I'm not saying that we've defined what the orders application is, what the inventory application is. No, we're just creating a structure and the tooling to allow that to happen. That needs to happen externally to the core project, which is Eureka. It's just simply, lots of interest involved in that. There's other talks even at this conference to discuss how we want to gather and create applications. So for now, Eureka just contains a totally suboptimal set of what I call mega applications. They're just there to exercise the mechanisms. Essentially, for a large part, Folio is an application to some extent. We'll define those structures later on and so forth. But for now, it is what it is. But one key thing to remember is that module descriptors need cleanup. So we have a set of rules that we've established as part of Folio for how you create permissions within a module descriptor and how you assign those permissions to the different interfaces. But it hasn't always been consistently implemented. And because, as I said, the manager applications attempt to interpret the permissions that it finds in the module descriptors, in many ways, it becomes very difficult to correctly interpret those, right? So we have workarounds in these applications, in the system services, but they're awkward, right? So it would be really great if we could clean up after pictures and allow a much smoother interpretation by the Eureka tools. Okay. All right, so let's have a few words on these manager services that I've hinted at many times. So the manager services, there are 3 that are being introduced here. So one is the application manager. So it's pretty clear what it does. You create it, you define an application, you deploy it into Folio, it gets registered in the application manager, and it goes through its mechanisms to interpret, what the capabilities are that are being delivered by this. The tenant manager is there to register the tenants. So it says, well, here's the new tenant and so forth, and here's their name, here's their URL, and finally, the tenant entitlement manager is essentially the intersection of the two. It defines which tenants have been granted access to which applications and therefore which possible capabilities. So you'll probably be familiar with these concepts, and right now they're all being delivered by Okapi in a central point, right? But in addition to what Okapi does, there's a number of different levels of automation that we can now introduce as part of the Eureka platform. Okay, so let's move on. And yeah, just a list of the technologies that are used as part of this particular service are listed below. Here's an illustration, sort of similar to the one I showed you at the beginning, but this is more on the hosting operations context, where essentially you have hosting automation here shown at the top with Jenkins as an example that basically is making calls to create tenants, to register applications, etc. Calls the services, which are these three services in this box. And those services will speak to Keycloak, create a realm, which is sort of equivalent to a tenant. It's a tenant context inside of Keycloak. Make bootstrap information available to modules so that it's the sidecar of the module so that they know there's this new thing, our new tenant has been added. And then Kafka is used to send messages, as mentioned before, to the sidecar for authorization. And finally, managed services provide define the routes in Kong to make sure the traffic goes to the right place. And for time, okay, lots of time. Okay, and again, we have another dedicated session for this tomorrow. We can get into some really scary details. Okay, and that's it. So actually, I probably didn't need to speak that fast, but I'm expecting there's lots of questions here. So why don't we go ahead with that? Jeremy.
I have a question about the application formalization piece of this, which I understand was not the main point of your talk, but I want to know specifically if the dependency between application and module is based on the interface or on the implementation of the module.
Based on the interface.
Yeah.
Yep.
So they're still swappable within the application, at least in theory. If I re-implement an interface, would I swap it out into the application without the rest of the system here?
I think so. What does re-implement interface mean?
Like if I have
it can be done.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually it's done not on, like we did not move the interfaces from open descriptor on application level. It's inside of application descriptor, we just describe a list of modules that it contains. But applications, dependency application supports the same implementation, and it means that we can have multiple versions of the same application. For example, you have, let's imagine, application login, yeah, and it contains only one module, mod login. And you can have another version of this application, like application login, custom Keycloak implementation. Yep. And inside of this application, you can put your own implementation of this module, and it will be compatible for all other things, for all other applications that depends on it. Yeah.
That's my question. Thank you so much.
Mike, you're next.
You mentioned earlier that patrons weren't part of the migration to Keycloak.
Correct.
Folio has users that are both staff and patrons.
Correct.
How are you determining which of the records are staff versus patrons?
So for the most part, and Craig, you can correct if I'm wrong, I believe that if they have permissions assigned to them, they're interpreted to be staff. And patrons don't have permissions, they shouldn't.
That's right. Yeah, so we have a migration API that we've implemented for users. And when you invoke that, it looks at the users and it basically says any users that have at least one permission assigned to them need an auth user record. So it means a record in Keycloak. So yeah, the presence of permissions is in.
think Jason's hand went up, but I think Wayne had his earlier.
Jeremy, I thought in the application descriptor that that actual module version were referenced. Now you're saying interfaces are referenced?
No, that's right. It's module versions, but like you said, the application to application dependencies, as long as those are still satisfied, you're okay, right? So.
Right, I understand.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Jason.
I was gonna ask on that, patron versus staff, what are y'all doing for like system users that aren't human interactive?
Well, we do have a whole, this is part of that really hairy secret stuff that we're going to talk tomorrow's session.
Okay.
So there's but there, yes, you want to summarize it at all or
Sure.
keeping the suspense?
Eureka, we provide the ability to declaratively say in your module script that I need a system user that has these privileges, right? In the platform, Eureka will create that user and manage it for you. And then it's the responsibility of the sidecar to obtain an access token for that system user and inject it as needed as part of those module calls.
Right.
So the modules themselves don't need to worry about any of that. They just make the API call and the sidecars handle those.
Right. And a side benefit is, right, the system users disappear from the user list management and no one's going to accidentally delete it at that point.
Yeah.
Which happens, I gotta say. Right.
What about external system users? Like for cron drops or something else going externally to a Folio, but that is not aimed to be a proper user.
Not sure I know what's an example of that?
Like the EDS.
EDS. Ah, okay.
Specific token associated with.
Yeah, so I think we refer to those as institutional users.
Yeah.
They're typically those are used for edge APIs and they're managed by system operators, right? So they're manually provisioned. Typically, you typically have to manually make sure that they're given the right permissions and so forth. You need to store their credentials in some secret storage and all those things, right? The system user mechanism that I was describing earlier can also be used for that, right? So it's not just system, but also tenant level users can be specified. So it's possible to simplify things for edge APIs as well. So you can just declare those in the edge module descriptors and say, I need an institution, a tenant level user with these particular privileges. It will be created and maintained for you, including storing of credentials in secret storage. So it should make that aspect of system operation should be simple.
It's more about the other direction. Not with me storing the credentials for the user, but basically creating long-living tokens for like a syncer that will interact with all my user objects when importing them or regularly syncing them with my external IAM. Because my patrons are in an IAM, so I still need to sync them. So I need a user to do this because we won't just be able to manually add like 80,000 users. 80,000 patrons.
I think I got lost somewhere along the way there, but I will say that you mentioned long-lived tokens. With the introduction of RTR that Vince mentioned earlier, that there are no long-lived tokens. They're all going to expire at some point. And how that happens, how you get a new token is different based on the different OAuth flows that are being used. So a client credential flow, for instance, won't use a refresh endpoint, right? There is no refresh token in that instance. You just basically need to send your client secret and ID again to get back the new token. But if it's a regular user in the system, then yeah, it's up to you or if it's some tooling or scripting or whatever it is to refresh that token. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, basically, I'll just provision them as regular users like I would provision a new user.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's an
Yeah.
option?
And I encourage you to attend tomorrow's talk as well. We'll get into some details. Jeremy, whoa, back again.
I apologize, 'cause I'm pretty sure I said this last year, but I do think it's important to point out, or have you confirm or deny maybe, But it does seem to me that the implication of application formalization is incidental to the Eureka platform. At least in theory, it could have been implemented on top of a copy, but it was a choice to introduce these other things for there are other benefits. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, it could be implemented, I think, in a copy, but looking at it from the different perspective, we're implementing Eureka. And so we should be going with applications because that's where you want to go. So make that part of it from the starting gate, you know. Oh, and
Just want to say that I think there are a couple of things.
good point. Yes. Let's see what's in chat here. All right. All right, we can hear you. Okay.
So yeah, the folks online might have missed some of the questions.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. There's no microphone in the room, unfortunately, so they're coming off my earbud. When will Eureka become reality with Flower releases? Okay, and this is from someone online. So we don't know. I mean, that's the decision for the community as to when we want to integrate. We would like to get it as soon as possible. And all of the Eureka code is already in the community repos. It's all there. It's just not part of the builds. I think a good goal for everybody would to say, you know, if we could sort of embrace it and adopt it in the community by, say, the Sunflower release, that would be a highly desirable thing. Question in the back.
Related question. The all apps have to be converted from Eureka to code, or without it's a mix of
I think you have to go all in on Eureka. I don't think you can have a mix with Okapi on part of it and Eureka on the other part, because you have competing components at that point, and the mechanisms, the authorization flows are very different, and it's probably not going to work very easily. Just check online if I got any other questions. So that was the only question still online.
But I did want to clarify one thing and then remark. So the module code itself doesn't need to change.
True.
So the module code, the modules that work with Okapi will work with Eureka as well.
So what do we have to change then?
So the same, a lot of the request headers are reused. So for instance, the exocopy tenant and exocopy token headers are still used by Eureka. And that's to Vince's point, to support backwards compatibility and sort of ease the transition to you, right? Same thing with some of the others like exocopy user ID, exocopy
Permissions for desired permissions.
permissions. Yeah. So we've reused those same request headers in those cases. That's one aspect of it. And the modules, since they're not the ones enforcing authorization, it's the sidecars. Modules don't even need to know that about capabilities or resources or actions or Keycloak or any of that. The modules are more concerned with the business logic, implementing circulation or inventory or whatever it is, right? So it's the platform that needs to worry about the authorization and tenant checks and all those things, and that's where the sidecar comes in. If we didn't implement sidecars, it would not work, right? Then the modules would have to enforce this.
Right. And it's basically the platform core that needs to be replaced, but the majority of the platform is not the core. It's all the modules, and those stay in place. Any question online? And we briefly touch on whether the sidecar code already reflects the full scope of a copy API functionality. In other words, isn't it reasonable to expect Eureka to keep all modules working that were working with Okapi? And there's probably some more up above that. This is from Thomas Stump. So, okay, so that's the question. So we do have some facade APIs.
Yeah.
Maybe this is what this is getting to.
Yeah, so I mean, I already answered part of that question that, yes,
Yeah.
we would expect all modules to function on Eureka
So,
if they function on Okapi.
speak into this, try that. That works.
In addition to that, there are some modules which consume the Okapi interface itself for things like checking tenant entitlements or looking at module descriptors or whatnot. And so to support those, we introduced this Okapi facade service, which is already in GitHub. basically implements a subset of the Okapi interface so that those modules that consume Okapi can continue to work without needing to be modified.
Yeah, try the microphone on the laptop because it's better. Can't guarantee that
I
it is.
think Mark had a question, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is a comment, and coming back to the question about when should the community migrate to Eureka? Just wanted to say that, well, the biggest library in the world, which is located in DC, and I can't really name them, but there's only one for the one on the Eureka property. It is going to be very costly for the community to maintain two versions because it implies double amount of development, double amount of testing, and so on. And so the sooner it is possible to switch to Eureka, the better. And so Sunflower might be, good, reasonable goal.
Wayne was first.
So I mean, I think this is, Craig has heard me say this before. I just want to point out to both Mark and Vince that the community would love to get behind this. I think people are very excited by it. We will need a reference implementation that is something repeatable that other hosting providers can, pick up and adopt.
And Mark has the
It doesn't
answer.
have to be like perfect or like,
Sure.
Eureka in a box, but it does have to be more than, it's all on GitHub.
Sure. And Mark has the answer for you right here.
Well, I would advertise another session. And I think that session is organized by the sysops group. And it talks about lessons learned on migrating from Okapi to Eureka. And in it, there will be a presentation from Keycloak's team. Keycloak's team supports the development teams and provides the deployment pipelines for setting up different environments, including Eureka environment. They created a number of health charts that can be reused. And then on top of it, we're fortunate to have two early adopters, big libraries. Can I mention that? One of them, so one of them is Cornell, the other one is National Library of Australia. So they are planning to go through initial early adoption. That is happening within the next couple of months. And it would be great to get some help from the community to work with us and the early adopters to create the necessary documentation. The documentation for what are the potential pitfalls of migrating from one platform to another, not necessarily from the sysops perspective, but from the end users perspective. That since we're changing the way since we're introducing capabilities, we have to do some training. And so having documentation and a number of other things.
I look forward to that.
Okay, I think Mike, you had some question earlier and
Sorry, I have something to add to the Mark's words. So regarding documentation, it's a really good question, and it's a high priority for us. And I want to mention that we already have a repository on GitHub on Folio, under the Folio organization. It is a Eureka bootstrapping platform. You can try to set up Eureka platform locally, and if to be honest, it would be perfect if many people will try to use Eureka locally and share feedback with us. So we will try to improve this documentation. And second thing, right now it's let's say also a high priority thing for us. We plan work related to documentation parody like Okapi has. So on Wiki, Folio Wiki, we have a big documentation, chunk of documentation related to single server deployment for Okapi and Kubernetes deployment. So the same things will be described how to work with Eureka as well. So both of them, how to work on Kubernetes platform and as a single server deployment.
Yes. So we're at time, but I think we can probably squeeze in a couple of questions, right? Mike?
Just seems there has been a question about whether you have thought about other architectural decisions. It's slightly scrolled down.
Okay.
Just the-
Scroll up, but nonetheless, Mike, go ahead. You've been waiting for a while.
So, just curious about the backwards compatibility and the comment about needing to double the development environments. So I'm trying to figure out what I missed when, because I thought you said that modules don't have to change in order to work with Eureka.
They don't.
So why?
Why do we double the environments?
Yeah, why would we need to environments?
Well, I think the point, Mark made the point about doubling environments, that if you have a copy-based system and a Eureka-based system, even if you have the same modules, you still have to do, end-to-end testing on each of them separately, just because people like to do full integration testing, that's all. But in my opinion, and it's not everybody's opinion, that if we move to this application formalization module and we can encapsulate applications and do very strong testing between them, then we reduce that barrier. In other words, you have a greater confidence that things will work if you take the application and drop it on another one. But that's
one
testing.
other aspect to it as well. So some teams are actually coding to Eureka specific things, right? So like the acquisition, not the acquisition team, the Thunderjet team is working on consortia support for roles. So you can create a role in your central tenant and then share it across your member tenants. And so obviously that's not going to work on the copy-based platform because there's no notion of roles and policies and all that. So some development teams do require a dev environment from Eureka.
Thanks.
Okay. So we are at time, but
Why Eureka?
why the name?
Why Eureka?
Eureka, so Eureka was just simply the name of the development team. All the development teams at Folio picked their name, and this team chose Eureka. We didn't have a name for the platform, and people just started calling it the Eureka platform. So we stopped trying to find a name and say, oh, we'll just call it Eureka. It's a good name for a platform. Why not?
The idea just came out of nowhere, right? It's like,
Just floated up to the top. Okay, I'm sorry, but I do think we have to be respectful of the next session, so.